Hello, Internet! Comics are pretty cool, right? A series of drawings, separated by these little boxes called panels, with little bubbles to convey dialogue. Wait a minute. They've been around for a long time, and some were even adapted into video games. Conversely, quite a few game franchises have received comic book adaptations, the most notable example being Sonic the Hedgehog with not one, not two, but 3 big comic book runs over the years. But what's really cool is when fans make their own comics based on video games. I used to draw a bunch of little comic books about video games when I didn't have anything better to do at school, but they weren't the kind you'd see on the early internet. No, back in the day people would rip sprites from games and use them in a program like Microsoft Paint to make comics. These are Sprite comics, and they've been around for quite a while. The earliest one I could find was called Neglected Mario Characters, dating back to 1997. As the name implies, it follows some lesser-known Mario characters in a bunch of different wacky scenarios. The artwork is as simple as possible, and the sprites say goofy things in each panel, which is what most Sprite comics are like. There's actually a surprisingly large cast of characters, and the fact that the comic started as early as it did was honestly impressive. But one of the first Sprite comics to really make it big was called Bob and George. Actually, it was almost just a regular hand-drawn webcomic, but the author wasn't able to get a scanner for his drawings in time. So instead he opted to use sprites from classic Mega Man games, most notably Mega Man 7. Speaking of the author, he actually appears in the comic as a character, which is somewhat of a trope with Sprite comics. Taking the form of a recolored Mega Man sprite like many of the other characters in the comic, most notably the titular Bob and George. The strip mostly consists of parodies of the classic Mega Man games with regular appearances from the original characters, and it's a pretty fun read. There's also the simply titled Zelda comic, released just a couple years after Bob and George. It's mostly based on Zelda 2, but there are also characters from later Zelda games like Navi and Sheik, as well as characters from entirely different series. Even the author appears occasionally as the Nemo sprite from the Dream Master NES game. It's a really fun little comic, and I'd recommend giving it a read. One of the bigger Sprite comics was 8-Bit Theater, based on the original Final Fantasy from the NES. The writing and characters are your typical Sprite comic flair, but it also feels a lot more like a comic book with the layout, and there are more gags relating to the mechanics of the original game itself. It's also one of the few Sprite comics to get merchandise, with a book containing the script of the entire comic, and a little tabletop RPG where the characters go to worlds from other video games. While this one might not technically count, I'd like to talk about it anyway. Kid Rad follows the characters of the titular fictional game as they leave its world and attempt to navigate a new society in cyberspace, one that's under the threat of corruption and destruction from vengeful sprites. There's a lot of things that set it apart from other Sprite comics, like how it's presented like a handheld console displaying the panels, which are actually made out of smaller sprites, allowing for a ton of animation. There are even parts where the writing actually takes itself seriously, albeit never too seriously. That actually reminds me a little bit of Wreck-It Ralph, since there are little cameos of existing games, but the majority of what you see is completely original, and there are plenty of gags derived from varying game mechanics. It's probably my favorite Sprite comic on the web, and there's so much to get out of it. But there's still one more for us to talk about. Mega Man Sprite Comic, the only webcomic on the internet that features real Mega Man sprites from actual Mega Man video games. You've got all the classic Mega Man characters saying and doing just the most random things you can think of. Every character has the same bizarre expression, Mega Man's first line in every comic is just, "What?" and there's no rhyme or reason to anything that happens. There's also a weirdly reoccurring theme of basketball in the comic as well. There's even a game made based on the comics, this little RPG where you fight a bunch of ghosts and the comic's staples wacky shenanigans ensue. And those were just a few of the many Sprite comics out there. Unfortunately, we haven't really seen any new ones since the 2000s. Maybe I should try and keep their spirit alive. Perfect.